Hello. We're ready to begin. Hello, everyone. I'm Brenda Nicodemus, and I'm a faculty member in the Department of Interpretation and Director of Interpreting and Transliteration Research Center. I would like to welcome you this afternoon to our sixth and final Colloquium series lecture, sponsored by the three different departments: the Department of Interpretation, the ITRC, Interpreter Regional Research Center, and GURIEC, Gallaudet University Regional Interpreter Education Center. Thank you to those three groups and units for sponsoring these 6 events, and we're hoping to have some other series presentations next year. I do want to thank all of you who are here in person as well. Thank you to the individuals that are watching this from a distance. I also like to recognize one guest with us, Dr. Gaurav Mather, who is an assistant dean of the graduate school here at Gallaudet University. Hello, and thank you for coming.
Certainly.
I also want to thank our interpreters, Carolyn Ressler and Stephanie Deja, who are here interpreting for us this afternoon. I also would like to thank Barry White from the TV department and streaming this live. Thank you. I would like to tell you a little bit about how we're going to present today. Dr. Christopher Stone will be presenting, but in a little bit of a different format than our previous series lectures. He's going to present for approximately 40 minutes, and then the respondent will be asking questions. Normally we do it that way, but today our respondent, Dr. Patrick Boudreau, will, instead of waiting to the end, will come up and ask Dr. Stone some questions during his presentation. So he will be asking questions, and they will be dialoguing, and then he'll talk a little bit more, and then we'll proceed with questions. So it's going to be nice. We'll give you time to leave around 1:50. If you have any questions at the end, we will open the floor up for those questions to take place. Thank you again for supporting these great lecture series that we've hosted this year. It's a great way to end the year with a wonderful presenter, Dr. Christopher Stone. We'll see you next year for the other presentations. I would like to now introduce Dr. Cynthia Roy, who will be introducing Dr. Stone. Hello, I'm happy to see all of you here with us, and I'm honored to introduce Dr. Christopher Stone, my colleague. He, of course, has all of the bio and biographic information. He received his PhD at Bristol University in the UK. And his degree is in Deaf Studies, Sign Language Interpreting. And he's the first person in the UK to receive that type of degree. His PhD did become a book. I'm sure many of you are familiar with his book. It's Toward a Deaf Norm, which is a wonderful book. I also want to tell you just a few parts of information about Dr. Stone, and because Christopher is not only a really good scholar, but he's also a very, very charming person. I've been here on campus for almost 10 years now, and Dr. Stone has been here a year and a half, and he knows more people than I do on campus. He walks on campus, and he's saying hello to everyone on campus, and I'm always asking, who this is and who that is, and he knows everyone on campus already. So that's how of a wonderful and warm person he is. He's good for us Americans to know because he comes from the UK and from Europe, where a lot of languages are normal. He speaks several different languages, and he also is familiar with several different sign languages. Not too many of us can say that. He's fluent in different sign languages, but he's also a certified interpreter in the UK, and congratulations, and a certified interpreter in the United States. He passed the NIC test, so congratulations to you. He's had quite a few worldly experiences. He worked in Uganda and Finland and some other countries as well. He's also internationally known scholar and interpreter. He interprets a lot of community events and knows how to interpret internationally. So we're thrilled to have him in our department, and it's a pleasure to have him and that level of competency and knowledge in the department, as well as experience and expertise with us. Thank you so much, and I would like to welcome Dr. Christopher Stone.
Are we set to begin? I'm getting the signal that I need to wait. I guess we're ready. Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone who's here in the room, and those of you who are watching this via live stream. It's a little unusual to sit back and watch the introduction because I have to wonder who that gentleman is that Dr. Roy was just introducing. It doesn't sound like me. Yes, I am multilingual, and I also speak multiple sign languages as well as multiple spoken languages. And I've been interpreted for a number of different language varieties, so at least there's one of us here who is fluent in several languages. Over the last couple of days, we had some email exchanges, and I thought perhaps maybe we could dialogue back and forth between Dr. Boudreau and myself in French, but we chose instead English. So if you look at the title of my presentation today, I'm going to share with you some information that really speaks to the issue when it comes to cognition and language acquisition. I think most of us are very well aware of the fact that individuals who are learning a language as a second language or also perhaps are learning a language that is a different modality are doing so later in life. I know that's very true of the UK, and it seems as if America might be a tad bit different, but in the UK, individuals are interested in becoming interpreters because they've seen it on television and they've never had an opportunity to interact with any deaf people. So typically they are 18 years or older when they first engage in learning the language. So their L2 is that sign language, but this is also what we're calling an M2 in that the modality is different, no longer being an auditory language, instead a visual language. So converting the language processing to a visual modality as opposed to an auditory modality is quite a switch for individuals. So that poses the question, how do we accommodate these learning needs in that they're learning a second language in a second modality? And if we look particularly at interpreters, we see some interpreters who have certain aptitudes and skills, but that might be a bit different from an interpreter who doesn't have the same kinds of aptitudes and skills, and what distinguishes those interpreters. About 10 years ago in the UK, the government made a determination that there was a shortage of interpreters, and in order to remedy that situation, they provided £1 million, which is the equivalent of about $5 million, hoping to see that they couldn't fix the situation and hoping that perhaps maybe they could see an increase in the number of interpreters that were realized as a result of the training. So the concern, though, is if the UK was going to support this kind of training, they wanted to make sure that there was some way that they would be able to verify that their tax monies and dollars are being spent in ways that were advantageous, that they were actually making an impact on those receiving the funds, and that they were meeting the goal that they set out to do, which is to produce qualified interpreters and increase the number of interpreters. So they needed some kind of benchmark, some kind of way to study that. At DCLA, we decided to undertake a study to determine whether or not the government was actually able to get a good rate of return on their investment. In order to do this, we wanted to track interpreters through their progressive academic career. In the UK, we have 4 years of study versus 3 years of study versus 4 years, as you have here in the United States. We wanted to take a snapshot of individuals and their learning as they progressed through their years of study. We also wanted to take a look at the interpreters' training prior to their being tracked into the interpreter field, and then once they were tracked into interpreter training courses, BSL courses, and then beyond. And we're very curious as well as to how individuals self-selected themselves to become sign language interpreters. What was their processing? What was their basic decision-making process that led them to embark on a career as an interpreter and seek training in that area? We wanted to better understand how people learning sign language, and as well as the interpreting process, developed skills. What were their cognitive processes, functions, and skills that were necessary to develop interpreting and second language skills, and what kind of training was necessary to ensure efficiency. We wanted to track the students along their studies. In the UK, it had been that there were several deaf studies programs. That's no longer the case, but if individuals wanted to become interpreters, they would first study in the field of deaf studies. And there were certain tracks, one of them being an interpreter track. Should, after they developed proficiency in the language and they demonstrated sufficient skill, then they could begin taking interpreting courses. If they didn't demonstrate adequate skill while in their deaf studies major in developing BSL language, then they probably wouldn't be tracked into the interpreter field. Some individuals pursued other careers despite the fact that they did have aptitudes and skills in interpreting, but nonetheless, we were trying to develop screening tools that would help us distinguish skills and better track people into an interpreter track versus a deaf studies track. So part of our study was to seek information as to what kinds of tests would provide us that information. We tested students when they arrived their first semester, then their third semester, and then their fifth, and then sixth semesters, to get a snapshot of where they were at, skills-wise, aptitude-wise, at each of these different points in their academic career. At some point, we wanted to be able to track individuals who pursued the interpreter track and those who continued on with deaf studies, to see if there were differences that we could determine, or if they were just simply a result of individual interests and not necessarily trends. There were a number of different tests that we had to select from, and we came up with a test battery that we felt would best determine interpreter skills and aptitude, and those tests would be most suited in determining whether or not a person had interpreting skills. I'm not going to blind you with science, so I will give you some description as to each of these tests so you get a sense of them. Some of these might be somewhat familiar to you, but nonetheless, I'll walk you through each of these. We felt that these tests would get at what we were aiming at. We know that traditional tests of memory look at digit span as to whether or not you can remember a sequence of 3 numbers versus 4 numbers versus 5 numbers. So that really tests memory processing, working memory skills. We also wanted to test those skills, whether an interpreter could recall numbers in the way they were given, and then if they could also give them in the reversed way, and wondered whether or not that would then translate into their ability to acquire a sign language. So that was our first battery test. Secondly, we had the matrix reasoning test, MR. This test looks at an individual's IQ, determining how a person's IQ, cognitive ability, really translated into their basic interpreting level, and if there was any kind of visual recognition, visual acuity that could be recognized into interpreters, and if in fact that logical sense that they developed also translated well into developing interpreting skills. Third test was we looked at interpreters' English language skills to see how proficient they were with the English language, and if whether or not that proficiency led and was a predictor to achieving skills in a second language and as an interpreter, if those skills would bolster their second language acquisition. Another test that we use Patrick and a colleague of ours came together and really looked at grammatical decision making, looking at different sentence formations and deciding whether or not a learner of sign language was able to distinguish a simpler sentence from more complex sentences, and how they were able to produce those sentences as the complexity increased in their learning and language acquisition journey. We had different repetition tasks, really looking at the phonological level of sign language proficiency. If people were able to look at a sign and reproduce that sign following all of the phonetical features of that sign and replicate it in its entirety. If they were able to follow those phonological rules, or if they deviated from it, and then determine how they did along their learning as we tested them periodically throughout their learning. What kinds of errors did we note in their phonological production? And then how did those errors either increase or decrease as they furthered their language acquisition? So these were the tests that we provided our subjects. The MLAT, the Modern Language Aptitude Test, is a test battery that we were interested in using. It really determines whether or not a person is good at learning language in general, whatever L2 that is, disregarding, of course, a different modality here, but just looking at a person's language aptitude to pick up a second language. We were hoping to see if that was an indicator of ability to learn not just a spoken language, but also a sign language, and if we could distinguish any differences between those who were learning a sign language versus those who were learning a second spoken language. There were a number of tests, and I promise this is the last slide where I will go through the battery of tests that we gave. These are psychological tests that we gave our subjects. There was a connections test where individuals had to look at a grid with 49 different signals, and they had to be able to use a numbering system and count out numbers from 1 to whatever number using basic eye-hand coordination skills. It requires some kind of a psychomotor dexterity skill to be able to complete this task. The second one is a connections alternating skill, where you didn't just have the numbers or the alphabet, but rather you had to do both. So you had to be able to do the letter A and then find the letter 1, and then the letter B, and then number 2. So just to go with the number system, where you're just counting out the numbers from 1 to 2, 3, and finding those on the grid, that's much easier than it is to try and shift tasks and be able to find an A and a 1 and a B and a 2. That looks to a person's ability to use cognitive flexibility. If learners are able to distinguish different parts of the language and use multiple tasks within the language. Then we had basic perceptual processing speed that we tested. We were able to show some individuals different pictures and ask them to be able to determine whether the images were the same or different when compared to one another. Some people have very good visual processing, and if so, was that an indicator of a person's ability to pick up a second sign language or pick up a sign language? And how did that translate into interpreting skills? We know that interpreters require ability to focus and disregard external distractors. Were these tests an indicator that interpreters who were proficient came into the field already having developed these focused skills and ability to really suppress distractors? My colleague, Brooke McNamara, also used a particular test related to interpreter traits, looking at particular values and traits that were predictive of interpreters' competencies. We wanted to see whether or not we could distinguish some of these traits that helped us understand who were best to become interpreters versus who were best to stay in the deaf studies field. If there were certain traits or personality identities that we could equate with interpreter skills. I know many of us know interpreters who have varying personalities, some being more assertive, others being more shy, but we're wondering if willingness to take risks also help with a person's ability to learn a second language and then go on to become interpreters. So, those were the tests we used. Now let's take a look at our subjects. We looked at undergraduate students. we had two different groups, the deaf studies and interpreting students, and then also the psychology students. We really wanted to be able to compare what we're calling the normal students, the control group students. It's easiest for us to access psychology students and to see if we could discern any differences between those individuals who decided to pursue deaf studies. They self-selected that major. Was there something about them, having some special kind of characteristic or traits that sort of lend themselves to pursuing that career versus another field? Then we also compared expert interpreters who had 20 years or more experience, to see whether or not they maxed out in their language ability. Were they able to continue to develop and grow through the years? And so we wanted to make the comparisons both of similar students, those in deaf studies interpreting with psychology, and then also with expert interpreters. I think this is self-explanatory. So let me tell you a little bit about why we selected these individuals. If we look at any university student, regardless of what it is that they're studying, what kinds of influences develop them as a student, and then looking at the length of time that they spend in that learning environment, what impact does that have on them? We also wanted to see if there was a difference between BSL learners and interpreting students, and then finally to see whether or not the training that was provided of these individuals, if they in fact were able to acquire certain things during that period of time, and if other things needed to wait until they gained experience before they could actually acquire. We looked at a lot of different studies and perceptions, and here are some of the findings. So we looked at, perception to see how people were doing in this area. We also looked at what we're calling here psychomotor speed, person's ability to process things and the speed at which they process things on a psychomotor level. And then we looked at cognitive controls. Could people change tasks quickly? Were they able to identify different markers and find those markers more easily than others? Did that in any way correspond to their language development? On the next slide, you're actually going to see the patterns test, just to give you an idea of what the subjects had to do. They had to identify whether or not the two images were similar or different, and if they were similar, they had to put an S, difference, they put a D, and they were timed. There was a particular time limit. Some of the images are the same, some are different, and some are a little hard to tell. I mean, think if you're going through very quickly, it might be hard to discern one from the other. I did want to share one thing, all of us as students, we were able then to discern who actually grew up using sign language, and if they used sign language in their as their first language, then we did not include them in the study. And we wanted to make sure that all of our students were part of this test. One of the students completed this particular test very quickly, and we came to realize that that person's first language was a character-based language, and so that's why they were able to move much more quickly through this, because being from China, they were able to quickly identify characters and distinguish them from another. So let's take a look at some of the results and the statistics as a result of these findings. And I'll show you the next slide now. So, what does that translate into? Well, basically it's that we're not very special after all. We're very similar to other people. There's no magic that allows us to be good interpreters, to really access language better. Maybe we develop those skills over time, but there are no raw skills or competency that bring us to a certain place. So, uniqueness perhaps is not the way we can define why we are what we are. So let's take a look at this next test. I'm going to show you 2 slides, and then I'll talk a little bit about both of them. There are 49 different circles. It's a 7x7 grid, and you start at the top left corner looking for a number 1 or letter A, and then you have to find the subsequent letters or numbers up to 49, right? So if you think of the alphabet there, 26 letters. So that's why you see the A with the star and the B with the asterisk, because once you get to Z, then you go back to find the A with the asterisk, the B with the asterisk, and then you repeat the grid until you found all 49 letters. So let's take a look at the results now. There are differences between the 2 sessions and also between 2 groups. So if we sort of grind the numbers, what do we see, what we find? We certainly did see improvement being made with people who were using sign language. Psychology students actually did worse. The second time, I don't know if it was because of boredom, but we did see rehearsal actually improved the scores of those who used sign language. Perhaps that was some indicator of future ability to learn language. We looked at the alternating connections, and we'll take a look at that particular test on the next 2 slides. Remember before, this connections test just had letters or numbers, and this has a mixture of both. Same process you follow from the very top left corner. You find the number 1 first, followed by the letter A, and then you have to find subsequent number and letters that correspond with what you found previously. So if it's A1, the next 2 numbers would be, or the next 2 circles would be around B2. So it's a much more complicated task. We're testing basic speed. And then also by adding a new rule, they have to additionally process the circles. As we know, interpreters are constantly switching between languages, switching between tasks, so we thought perhaps this was a good predictor of how an interpreter would do should they score well here. Learning both a language and interpreting skill might be a predictive measure. We do see a difference between the BSL learners and the control group, and let's see whether or not there's a statistical difference. Certainly there was improvement. I know that it's kind of difficult to see much more than pretty colors on the graph, but I did want to make sure that you had a good sense of what the meaning was behind those graphs. So here's a good summary for you. So sometimes if you give repeated tests, students develop a familiarity with the repeated tests. And so we had a 2-month delay between when we administered the test with these students, just so that we could assure that students were not doing better because of a learned kind of test-taking ability. we did want to see whether or not development of sign language skills had something to do with some kind of psychological acuity, psychomotor skills. I don't think that we can say we came to an answer that would solve all the problems of the universe, but what it is that we assume to be the case, we do have some scientific proof now to back that up. Any kind of an academic setting, we always want to make sure we can substantiate our claims with scientific-based data. And in this case, I think I'm sharing information you probably already know, but at least I have evidence to back that up. So we see the psychology students really did pretty pathetically, to be honest. I guess I should back that up. The data did not necessarily say that it could be a decision you come to on your own. If we look at adults above the age of 18 learning BSL as a second language, if we look at their raw perceptual processing skills, we do not see an improvement in this area. If we look, however, at their basic psychomotor skills or their task switching ability, there is improvement that's been realized in their ability to really do that more mind-hand coordination, and that does seem to indicate and reflect what we would assume to be the case. Likewise, if we look at the task switching ability, as interpreters have to go between two different languages, we do see an improvement here as well, with greater fluency in the language being achieved. Looks like I have some questions now from our respondent.
Thank you. Before I ask you questions, I just want to share with you he's done wonderful work, and there's very few work that focuses on this type of research and what it means, and really taking a look at the cognitive process. But I also like to notice that the generational changes since the 70s, typically our students are interested in coming and going and taking a major, and there's no gatekeeper to different majors, and now we can understand what it means to be trained, and if it was very much a self-appointed kind of major, if you're going in, and what the difference is. So in the study of 2004, there's one particular test, the VMS, Visual Mechanics Skill Test, Visual Motor Skills Test. Can you talk a little bit about that test in comparison to yours?
Interesting. Sign language studies has different groups. I guess they talk about the Virginia Quality Assurance Test. There's also the RAD test. There's work that's done in the community, work that's done in the area of education. And I think educational interpreters are something that's very interesting. If we look at the ways that educational interpreters process information and the resources available to them, obviously I have interest in studying each of these areas, but I do believe that individuals who have experience would rate it differently from those who are just learning. So can we take a snapshot of people who are right now in the process of learning and have predictors as to which particular kind of interpreter groups they would be best suited for? At this point, I don't believe we have those predictors. We can look at some raw skills that can be improved upon, the mental task switching and that sort of thing, and development of a BSL language being important. So those two issues may provide foundational skills that are necessary that can be built upon to provide interpreter proficiency in the language. As to where they go beyond that initial proficiency, that's yet to be studied. I think we looked primarily at just learners of interpreting.
I thought so. So they gain a certain skill and then they max out and they plateau at a certain point?
That could very well be the case. I mean, if you think about a deaf person's perception and how it used to be that it was the deaf person who encouraged individuals to pursue a career in interpreting versus the way things are these days when students actually self-select that major and seek that kind of studying on their own. The university can screen out individuals who may be not so well suited for that field. But if you think about it, maybe if that person pursued the field the next 15, 20 years, 25 years throughout their interpreting work, if they worked diligently and studied to pursue this, they might be able to become the skilled interpreter that they're looking to be. I mean, we have a certain amount of skills we can impart upon a student if they're majoring in interpreting. We have a certain amount of time with them. At what point do we decide as faculty that perhaps the university setting is not going to meet the needs of that particular student because of the limited time we have?
I have some other questions that I'll hold off on asking until later. Thank you.
Absolutely. All right, so let's move on to part 2, if everybody's all set to go. I hope you're ready. You got your popcorn in hand, all set to go? So, very good question that was asked. As a student progresses through the program and then goes on to become fluent in BSL and become a long-time interpreter, how do we compare, their student experience versus the professional interpreter experience? So the psychology students didn't make much improvement over time, so we'll leave that group for now and look at the other 2 groups that we have, those students who are learning BSL as students, looking to see whether or not they continued to develop language skills, or did they reach a point where they maxed out. As interpreters first begin learning a language, oftentimes they develop those skills and they may continue learning, or they may hit a ceiling at some point. So this is the issue we wanted to look at. We wanted to do a comparison of our interpreting students with those expert interpreters who'd been working for 10 years out in the field. They were credentialed interpreters. They'd already graduated from that same program that our students were currently enrolled in. And we wanted to make comparisons to see whether they did in fact max out in their language development, or if that language development continued over time. Again, I'm showing you some stats here that might not have a lot of meaning for you. It looks as if there are some differences between our student versus expert group. There are some differences. However, I think if we were just to summarize them, they're best put in this next slide. Again, perceptual processing and psychomotor skills were seen very similar between both groups. The individuals with 10 years experience clearly were older individuals. And we know as time goes on and a person ages, their cognitive ability begins to decline. Bad news for some of you. And by old, I'm talking about people who are above the age of 35, so let me clarify that. And I'm believing at this point I'm on the wrong side of that 35. I'm looking in the audience, and I'm guessing some of my colleagues who are not all here are as well, beyond the age of 35. So cognitive processing does reach a plateau, a ceiling point. And so perhaps that's the reason why we saw no perceptual processing differences between the students and the expert interpreters. Psychomotor skills as well, we didn't see a difference between the student interpreters and the expert interpreters. Once again, it looks perhaps they may have maxed out in their ability to process at that level and then began declining as a result of age. So with that being the case, we train interpreters, and perhaps the level that they attain at graduation is the level that they will retain throughout their career. Now this third area of task switching, we predicted that the expert interpreters would be more adept at this ability to task switch. They would typically find themselves engaged in this kind of process more regularly, but instead we only saw marginal differences between the BSL learners and the expert interpreters. So what's all this mean? Obviously, you need to be able to have some visual perceptual processing ability, and you also need to have psychomotor skills in order to learn BSL, and you can improve upon those 2 skills over time. If we're looking at adults as opposed to children, we know that children can learn in L2 much more quickly. They acquire that language and task switching much more easily. And if we look at BSL, we see at the same time there is some gain that can be made with increases in cognitive control. So we wanted to be able to, test our students week 1 of their first semester, but it was far too early in their learning experience, so we really couldn't see the amount of impact that was made as a result of their learning. We tested 10 weeks into their learning, and so as a result, we couldn't get those raw initial first week scores. They'd already seen early benefits of their learning as a result of having 10 weeks of instruction prior to our testing. So moving on, we wanted to look at the MLAT to see whether or not if these individuals just maybe were adept at language learning, language acquisition. And so we gave this test, and this test has been given to multiple college students. So we wanted to compare that test to see if they were to distinguish the regular students from any BSL learners. So at first it looked as if there was some phonological work and working memory predictors that we could see here, and that would make sense. We know that when you think about a sign language, if you're in a sign language class, you're not using a lot of written skills. If you have a written system, that means you see, some kind of biological movement that's required with that. As well, if you're learning another language, then you would be using more of a morphological-based system where you would be looking at a word, hearing a word spoken, and then you would have to do some kind of motor skill to write that word down, and that may help retain the word. And also, of course, languages have a written system that help you pronounce the language, because sign language doesn't have a written system, and most sign language students don't have any exposure to any kind of a written form of a language. So they have to see that a visual representation of a letter in the alphabet is equated with that letter. So it has to become a psychological reality for me to connect the sign with the understood letter. So there's no phonological way to remember that auditorily. It has to be more of a visual phonology that's tapped into in order to learn the visual language. So there are some predictive variables, but nothing that really stood out strong. If you compare this one particular test with a full battery of tests, the 5 different measures, we see a lot of similarity in terms of predictive values in their scores. Nothing that really stood out. Writing did not seem, of course, because there is no written system of the language. Those programs didn't have any training of sign language writing systems, and so people weren't accessing or tapping into that. There was a grammatical awareness and understanding of the language, but only in its visual sense. So it seems as if, having an L2 language, if you're good at learning a language in general, that would make you better suited for learning BSL. But this brought into the question of how modality impacts the learning of a second visual language. So because a person has adept ability to learn a second language, it may not always translate in their ability to learn a sign language because of the modality influence. Learning a language that's a different mode will have an impact on the person's acquisition of that sign language. So one thing is about looking at language, but secondly, we wanted to look more closely at interpreting. So, we understand that language learning has an impact on interpreting, but what we found with our results here was it sort of did, kind of a kindish sort of way, had implications. We obviously know that if you can't use a language, then obviously you can't interpret that language. That's a given. And this test basically speaks to that. If you can use a language, though, it doesn't necessarily mean that you can interpret. You might have very good skills as a language user, but you end up with this bottleneck because language skills and interpreting skills don't always translate equally. So then next we looked at English skills. If a person has well-developed L1 English skills, is that a good indicator that somehow they'll be better at learning BSL or be better in interpreting? So we see the BSL learners, session 1 and session 2, and then we also see the expert interpreters compared. So English skills are acquired and worked on during a person's college studying. So they came into the field or into their studies having somewhat established English skills, but as time went on, they worked at improving those skills. If we look at the expert interpreters, we would assume their skills would be better, and that was shown true on this test. I think many interpreters who have 10 to 15 years experience under their belt will often speak to the younger interpreters' inability to use English proficiently. But that would make sense because they're 10 to 15 years younger than the expert interpreters. So, of course, they have not yet experienced multiple different situations as an experienced interpreter would, and as a result, their English skills would not be as well developed. They're still in the language learning journey process, and so their English skills would not be as proficient as the experts. But we can see that if we continue to work on their English skills while they're in training, these student interpreters can actually perform better on English tests during their exit exams versus their beginning. But it doesn't also necessarily mean that a person who has better English skills will be a better interpreter. So English skills alone does not necessarily make a better interpreter. So then we looked at who decides to become an interpreter. So it's those people who have these outlandish, crazy personalities. BIS is a measure of impulsivity. Impulsivity also means a person's willingness to take a risk. And we know that there are some studies that tie in language learning, especially when it comes to deaf children and lip reading as well. If people are more willing to take a risk, the end result is that they're able to do better at that task. Those who are less willing to take a risk make less improvement in that task. So risk-taking is an important character trait to have. If you become overly shy and overly sensitive to criticism, then it can be very difficult for you to take a risk and be willing to, make mistakes that are necessary part of language acquisition and interpreting process. So it seems as those individuals who are more impulsive in nature were more interested in becoming interpreters. I would say perhaps that means not necessarily that it's about a person's arrogance or ego, but rather more about their impulsivity, willingness to take a risk. We haven't really looked further at that data to get a better picture of how that translated into the interpreters to students and the interpreter experts. As to how that impulsivity plays out into those two groups, more data analysis needs to be done. So, the summary for part 2 you'll see here on this next slide. So if you're good at learning language, you have some of those cognitive abilities that translate into learning sign language easily. Also, looking at language learning, we see that as a bottleneck for learning interpreting and developing interpreting skills. We know that's very true. Our program requires here that you have sign language proficiency before you come in to study interpreting. So you have to be fluent in the language so that you can then begin perfecting and working on establishing that language even further. And we also understand that individuals must have within mind that their English will continue to learn or to improve as they go through their years of learning, and that learning doesn't end at graduation, that it's more of a lifelong English learning acquisition process that they embark on. I think these last 3 bullets are self-explanatory. So we'll go back to the responder.
Great. Thank you. Based on my experience in teaching, when students come, they're very impulsive, and we typically look at a variety of students and how they learn and their personality. So, and if you're talking about the ACTFL, the teacher standards in America, and you have a different standard in Europe, right? But they're pretty similar to the ones we have here. And looking at those standards, we look at the higher ranked and more superior the student is as they can negotiate complex issues better. So as they move along the program and learn language and their skills get better, but then it's harder and harder to, and it takes more time to improve, as we've seen in this expert group. If you look at this measurement, and how do you compare the L1 and L2, and how long does it take to make that transition?
You know, that's a good question. You know, this also includes a number of other results as a result of different tests, looking at sign language and interpreting skills. I know, just speaking from my own experience, I taught in the UK as well as here in the States, and if students come into the program, are learning a language while at the same time they're beginning to do some translation work and some interpreting work, we have to make sure that the work that they're doing actually ties into their language skills. So I can't, you know, role play complex negotiations and have them interpret or translate that if they haven't developed language skills yet. So there's this tension, this interplay between language and interpreting skills, and how do we make sure that the students have the language skills that they need to be able to take advantage of and practice the interpreting skills? How do we maximize and really draw out their language learning experience so that they're more able to develop those interpreting skills? So we just have to find a way to be able to do that.
Right, the MLA tests, language testing is important. Should we develop our own standardization for visual learning?
You know, it would make sense because of the 5 areas that are part of that test. The actual test has an ability for a person to hear a set of numbers from whatever language. So you listen to those numbers, you rehearse those numbers, and then you are told, you know, this particular letter combination means the letter 1 or number 1, this combination means the number 2, and then you are tested on your ability to hear those sounds and translate that into the numbers that correspond with those sounds. So they allow time for rehearsal and memory and training. There's also phonetic writing portion of that test. You use the IPA, where you have to be able to look at a series of objects and see how things will be pronounced, and there's a grammatical portion of it where there's categories and sentences that have to be discerned from others. Another portion of this test is rote learning, where you actually have to learn information and then spit it back out in its written form. So some of those tests tie into written language, and hearing people can use those to be indicators of learning. If you're looking at a spoken L2, or do you have the ability to read another alphabet from another language? Are you able to understand how a different language would use a different letter or a sound that's different from yours? I mean, think about French and English and the comparisons we can see between the sound systems and the letter systems of those languages. If you can understand and distinguish, you know, how those sounds are different in their respective languages, that shows language aptitude. So how do we translate that into a visual language? It seems as if the ability to have that back channel feedback that comes from a spoken language being simultaneously or a few seconds delayed being heard by the speaker, that provides input to language and the ability to use language to help you modify the language to make sure you're pronouncing it the way it should be. Of course, that's going to be very different if we're talking about a visual sign language. From deaf people who have native language being a visual language have been able to perceive the language used in their environment by their parents. They've been able to see it used by adults in all different ways and forms from all different perspectives, and they're able to use that kind of 360-degree perception of language and understand it. So how do we measure that kind of language perception in people who are learning a visual language?
You're comparing sign language to a written form of language. We do see that, and that's typically more acceptable. There are different approaches, different models of this, of course, but do you think that having the introspect on sign language or being able to see sign language is different from the written mode? And should we include and experiment different approaches to the written system to use for sign language, and use a variety of those systems to use for sign language as new findings?
Certainly. I think it'd be interesting to see if there would be something available like that. And also, I think you and I both kind of interested in academics and the scientific part of it. It's interesting for us to look at people who grew up using sign language versus L2 users of sign language, and how it is they perceive and understand language, and how their written language forms as a result of that. What kinds of phonological indications do we see people have not yet developed? What kind of different syntax is evident in people who are learning L2 versus those who have it as their L1?
I'm sure that we can learn quite a bit from that type of research. Thank you.
Certainly. Boy, I don't know. It seems like we separated a bit too fast, and maybe you're not ready. You haven't yet gotten your popcorn for the next portion, so I'm going to ask that you bear with me just a few moments. Indulge your patience here. We're just about done. It won't take much longer. Okay, so we've covered a lot of material here. We're interested in a lot of different kinds of cognitive control and mental tasking, task switching. We look at bilingual individuals like codas who grew up, or people who use Catalan as a spoken language from birth, and their ability to do mental task switching. So we do have some evidence available to us in spoken language, but unfortunately we don't have the same kind of data available in sign languages. Do people growing up bilingual, bimodal, have the same kinds of similarities that we'd see people who are bilingual? How do we compare those kinds of learnings in our two groups of subjects in our data? So we're looking at students who were in the process of learning BSL and compared them with our expert interpreter group. We would expect there to be some general cognitive abilities for the ability to filter out extraneous information, to be able to attend to a particular task, and so we wanted to test that. We used a classic test called the flanker task test, where you have to look at different arrows going different directions. We know that this was used for Catalan and bilingual spoken language users. We wanted to see how this test would be replicated with people who are learning a visual language. For the next 3 slides, you'll see samples of the test. The subject is supposed to look at the arrow. That's the target arrow in the center of the slide. If the arrow beside it is pointing in the same direction, then they had to hit a button, or they had to hit a button indicating the direction of the arrow. If the arrow was going one way, they had to hit one button. If it was going the other way, they had to hit another button. And then that was followed by another task where there was an arrow, a target arrow with another arrow with it. They had to determine whether or not the arrows were all going congruently in the same direction, or if the other arrows were going in the opposite direction of the target arrow. Were they able to ignore the distractors and only focus on the target and respond accordingly? All right. So, everybody ready for me to move through the next couple slides? On the last slide, there were no arrows, so don't concern yourself. I saw you trying to simulate the test. So the test is just a 1-minute long test. You're repeatedly exposed very quickly to these different images with the arrows on it, and you have to click correspondingly. We wanted to look at the people learning BSL versus the expert interpreters, and certainly you see the graph here. There are some distinguishing characteristics in each of these groups. So let me show you the numbers that match the bar graph. For those of you who may not be familiar with statistics, If you have a low P score, then that is a good thing. A high P score is an indication, negative indication. So it actually looked as if the high score would mean that that person doesn't have a very good chance of really being able to answer the respondent. On the test of expert interpreters, we only gave this test to them one time, but we tested the BSL learners a couple of different times to see how their scores differed. We tested them the first year, and we did see a difference between themselves and the expert interpreters. The second year, there were still differences, but by the third year, they were fairly similar in terms of their scores, not statistically different. The BSL learners were able to improve upon their attention ability, and it seems as if that's related to their learning BSL. So it seemed as though learning an L2, M2, perhaps the different modality, would have an impact. Other studies really don't try to suppress the language, so we didn't really get a good sense of cognitive control. With our group of adults, we were able to see that some improvement was made in a person's ability to task switch and in their ability to have focused attention, ignoring distractors. So we did see improvement, and this is a finding that's different from ASL studies that have been done. Karen Emery's group and her publications have found findings that are different from what we have. It also does not appear that there is a substantial increase in improvement. We do see that as over time, as the BSL students learn more language, they're better at attending, as are the expert interpreters in general. And so there is cognitive advantage to learning BSL, but it does appear as if that cognitive advantage maxes out after a given amount of time. We also were looking at our different groups of students. With this, we were looking at students who were majoring in deaf studies versus those who were majoring in interpreting, and it would be predicted that we would probably see interpreters being better able to be more focused and ignore the distractors. But that hypothesis was dead wrong. It seems that the deaf studies students were better able to focus, that the interpreting students actually were a bit more distracted. So with that, we were very curious to understand our predicted outcome was not realized. So even though students actually didn't do as well as we thought they would, maybe it's because interpreters are a bit nosy and always looking at what's happening around in their environment, or perhaps it means that they need to take that kind of a risk. They need to be impulsive, and that risk-taking and impulsivity results in more distracting and non-focused behaviors. And the training that's given should be focused on helping them improve their focus. So this test was no way correlated with their course scores or test results in their actual formalized courses. So we'll take a look at the results now. So it could be that we have a belief that training actually imparts something on the students that it really doesn't, that it's just their own natural cognitive development that occurs with or without our training. In our test, though, what we came to realize is that it does seem that there is some correlation between if a good student is good in a particular subject matter, as well as, the instruction is given in such a way that they're able to understand it, then they're going to do well. Not rocket science there, right? That's pretty commonly understood. But at the same time, if we look at students when they arrive and their BSL A scores when they first came into their program, and then compare them as they progressed over time, we do see positive change, indicating that the training actually does impart knowledge. So I think obviously more research needs to be done in this area. It does seem that there are some interesting results from the data that we've done this far. So now ready for the big conclusion. So just going back, it looks as though learning a sign language as an adult does have some benefit in improving psychomotor skills as well as task switching. It also appears that for adults, that while improvement can be made, it is marginal improvement, nothing very dramatic. We look at bilinguals who grow up bilingual, we might find different evidence, but it seems as if adult learners actually have marginal benefit. And general language ability does in some way have a positive advantage for sign language users. It does allow them to better develop their second language if they have well-developed first language skills. Generally speaking, if a person has good language skills in both languages, the sign language and spoken language skills, they likely will be good interpreters. So it does influence their interpreting performance, but it is not a dead indicator that they will be qualified interpreters. And it does appear that one of the character traits of interpreters, or people who choose interpreting as a career, is that of risk-taking, impulsivity as it's labeled here, and that upon graduation, interpreters continue to improve upon their language ability, and at the end of their program, students have done better, but not as good as the expert interpreters. If you remember the task that had the arrows, we did see improvement of the students over time. It seemed as if there was a max point of 3 years where that improvement could be realized. Looking at ASL bimodal studies, we see a little bit different results here. Further supporting the notion that it's important to teach students language in isolation and not try to sign and speak languages at the same time in language learning environments. So once again, just continue to repeat that notion of the importance of having language segregation in terms of language teaching. I think that I am just about done, but there may be some references here, lots of references.
We're at our last round. Thank
Good.
you.
I mean, no, go ahead.
Okay. Now, in speaking about the L1 and L2, you focused mostly on L2. Clearly, people have a foundation of English as a spoken language as their M1. But help me clarify the difference between skills and mastery knowledge with the grammatical rules, and then versus skills. Someone having the skills.
Well, perhaps I can't. I don't know. To me, it's kind of all part of the same thing.
Okay, from what I see, skills is something that you're using the language, you're playing with the language and manipulating it, and the other may be having a clear understanding of the language grammatically and the whole foundation.
I know we've talked before about BSL, GJT, the grammatical judgment task. I haven't analyzed the data with that particular test, but wondering if a person's ability to recognize the rules and make grammatical judgments as to what's a grammatically correct versus incorrect structure. Using, I think, a language also comes into play with a person's skills. We understand there are different levels of language usage, and we can more easily identify those levels. Some might be more acceptable and others may be more flexible. So let's say, for example, if you're used to conversing with someone who's more able to understand language when it's not used in its perfected form, that perhaps adjusting the syntax would still be understood. But there are certain kinds of errors of a language being produced that would be very difficult to understand, particularly on the phonological level. If we move up to the syntactic level, errors may need some clarification to understand the meaning, but they might be more acceptable than those at the phonological level. So if those rules are a natural part of a person's cognition and part of their mental schema, then that probably is going to play out into them being more proficient users of the language.
Like learning the language by immersing yourself versus a classroom and memorizing rules of the language. But typically, you're more tolerant of grammatical errors of someone. You can understand them and you ignore that. But how is the LT user in their world experience learning in the 3-year time frame compared to a person that's been immersed in it, with somebody that may be working as an interpreter for 10 years?
It's very interesting. In those students that we tested, they were all in immersion kind of environments. They were using the language on a daily basis, fully immersed in the language. They would attend lectures where the professors were using the sign language. First year they had interpreters, but the second and third years, everything was presented to them in sign language. So it was very much an immersion practice that was undertaken at the university. Some places it's a bit more easy to have physical structure that you enter and it is there, that sign language is always used, be it a particular house or department. Other places it might be a little bit difficult because maybe that department is part of a larger context where that sign language is not used predominantly. So it's harder to kind of encourage people to sign in that area that's outside of that focused, localized area.
That's interesting because there's not a specific geographic area where you use sign language, it's just here and there. So just one last question for you. The bilingual advantage is focused on in the interpreting field and making improvements, but there's a lot of research and a lot of people who are learning several languages have more cognitive ability and advantage to use spoken language. So how does sign language and spoken language and interpreters compare when you're learning various languages?
It's interesting. I know there's a lot of work being done by BSL on the bilingual advantage. People who grow up bilingual, most of it's looking at native users and how they've learned language during that critical language period, between the ages of 6, 7, and 11, depending on your theory as to what that cutoff age is. I also know there was one study that was done, applies similar kinds of interest, looking at people who are deaf learning 2 sign languages. Looking at the advantage of using 2 sign language and looking at people have looked at one modality versus another modality, but what if we looked at people learning 2 sign languages having the same modality, determining whether or not there is evidence of cognitive language gain. If you see a native signer, I think Karen Emery has done some work, and Jenny Barnes, looking at native users of the language who are codas. And again, these studies are based in America. It's interesting, at DCAL we've tried to have similar studies where we had individuals who were codas, and it didn't seem as though, it was very difficult to get these individuals into a place using language naturally, and then trying to, from that, get them to use spoken language as well. We could not establish the right conditions to elicit any kind of blends. We had many different staff in our building. Some were codas, some were non-codas, some were growing up native users of the language, and no matter what environment or whom we placed them with, we couldn't elicit from that those language blends between their spoken and sign language. David Green, a colleague of mine who also works at DCAL, was looking at bilingual communities, and some communities find it perfectly acceptable to do code switching, and other communities it's unacceptable. it's one language used at a time. So there are, I think, probably different kinds of profiles that we would have to investigate if we require inhibiting a language versus another language, and how that would impact a person's learning journey. We can do blends if we have two different modes, but you may not be able to blend if you have a similar mode that's being used. I think a lot more research needs to be done.
Right. It's what's appropriate and what's actually being done and accepted by society. That's great, and I look forward to more of an analysis. And now we'll let the audience members ask questions.
Great. You have 6 minutes before your class, so we may have time for questions. I have a colleague of mine who's coming up now. Dr. Brenda Nicodemus has a question.
Thank you. That was a wonderful presentation. One thing I'm still obsessing on is that age 35 and up.
You and I both.
Wondering, it's not my question, but I was just wondering if someone actually could develop a test of wisdom and have that test done to see if there was presented something different. We can discuss that more later. Anyhow, using this practical plan, I know there's a lot of discussion about screening and interest screening for students. What's your opinion on using this type of test result for screening students? Should we use it, or should we just be using this theoretically?
That's a good question. You know, I think if we look at screening tools, typically they're driven by particular topics. So first it's going to say, if you want to screen someone out to say that you can't interpret versus you can't be in this program, there's two different things. You know, maybe somebody is not going to be able to be well suited to be able to learn a language in just 3 to 4 years. So maybe there are other different ways that they could develop their skills through the community to become an interpreter. So, you know, right now, in terms of the results that I have, I don't think they speak to whether or not screening tools should be used or not. But I do think it's interesting that we do have this innate subconscious sense of whether a person has particular skills and traits, and we are able to use that to better discern who can be able to be a proficient interpreter. So we do have some kind of understood ways that we go about assessing a person's suitability, but nothing really evidence-based to this point. And if I could add to your test of wisdom, Barbara Bozer Mercer is a researcher who has done some work in Switzerland. And she has worked with the EU interpreters, people who have been doing this for many years, top interpreters in their field, cognitive processing psychologists for a number of years. She right now is, let's just say, a bit older. And it's fascinating for me to see how many of the EU interpreters are now reaching their 60s, even their 70s. Actually 70 years old in the field of interpreting. I mean, that's double the magic number, right? So how is it they're able to work? What kind of wisdom are they able to apply to their work? And also, if we talk about learning versus maintenance of their learning, cognitive decline might occur, but it might be compensated by other skills that are learned, other strategies that are undertaken that compensate for the cognitive decline. I think it all comes back down to learning, though, and what happens after that learning is established.
Any other questions from our audience members?
Well, thank you for coming. I also wanted to thank the two interpreters. So I know I'm good. I gave them the materials a little bit late, so they did a wonderful job despite getting the materials a bit late. So thanks to both of them.
Great job.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Stone. This was very enlightening. I know this was a lot of work, and it gave us a lot to think about. Thank you, Patrick, for your comments as well. And I would also like to say hello to our Dean Agbula, and Dean Erding, who are with us this afternoon. Thank you for coming. And that ends our sixth presentation on our Department of Interpretation lecture series. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation, and we'll see you next year. And I just wanted to check if we have our CEU forms here. If you're here to earn CEUs for RIT, please feel free to see our student here, and we'll take care of that. Thanks so much again for coming. Bye-bye.